Welcome back to the fifth quadrant. Welcome back to Pascal's Wager, and welcome back to the integral stage. Those are my alternative names. I'm trying them out. You're watching or listening to or possibly smelling our Love the System series, where we explore politics, procedures, protocols, and other inter-objective practices. Today, we're going to do something a bit special. I'm here with some guy named Josh to discuss the simultaneous differences and overlaps between what we might call meta-progressive and post-progressive politics. Those names are contested and the branding is evolving, but basically there are some subtle distinctions within the general field of integrative, developmental, and liminal politics. And my philosophy says that's exactly where to look for more depth. When Josh and I were preparing for this, I told him a story about my attempt to deliberately get into Led Zeppelin a few years ago, and I couldn't quite figure out why people thought they were so great, and it wasn't until I listened to two almost identical versions of Dazed and Confused that I got it. The 1969 Yardbirds with Jimmy Page on guitar doing a version of the song, and less than a year later, Led Zeppelin with Jimmy Page on guitar doing a version of the same song. These performances were the same enough to be different, so I was no longer comparing apples and oranges. I was sinking into the depth afforded by the nuance that occurs in areas of blended similarity. That's where I think we're going to get to today. That's where I hope we're going to get to, politically speaking, as well. We're going to try to get to know Josh a little bit better and allow our other circulating network of meta communities to get up to date about what he and Steve and other developmental politics folks are doing lately. So fresh from his holosync jogging away of his dad bod, it's Josh Leonard. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Layman. Dude, that last one caught me by surprise.
Yeah, I just saw it yesterday. Thought I'd throw it in.
Yeah, luckily you can't see the dad bod half of me, so you'll just have to take my word.
For people who don't know, what is your role? What is your job? What is your position? Where are you situated in all this?
Yeah, so I'm the executive director of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, which is a think tank started in 2013 by Steve McIntosh and Carter Phipps. And the think tank has evolved quite a bit, as the name might suggest, since it began. I didn't really join until February of 2021, where I was hired as the executive director. And it was after Steve published the book Developmental Politics, which kind of upgraded the philosophy, applying integral and developmental philosophy to politics, sort of upgraded that approach. And so we were ready to kind of grow as an organization, and start to put this out there, hopefully, a little bit outside of the liminal web space, and start to get it into some of the mainstream thinking around how we might resolve some of the political differences we have. So anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but the think tank itself has been around since 2013. It was initially focused on climate change and applying sort of integral philosophy to climate change. But Steve and Carter essentially recognized really quickly that any meaningful action forward on climate change was being stymied by what was then a sort of growing political polarization. Now, looking back, we can see that was the start of the crazy kind of levels of polarization that we see now. And that's ultimately what the think tank is focused on, is addressing cultural and political polarization. There's other things we do, there's other things we hope to do in the future, but for right now, we feel like until we can help make progress on that issue, nothing else really makes sense to focus on.
That makes me curious about where polarization leaves off and fragmentation begins. Because if we have a sense that there's a system, we go, oh, that system is maybe overly dividing into its two halves. And if we could just bring it back together, we could get it going in the right direction again. But there's another sense in which maybe things are just coming apart and there's no centralized background system, and the whole society, the whole world is evolving into some much more fragmented, overlapping community of pluralistic networks or something like that. And there isn't going to be any majority anymore.
Right.
So like, when you look at the problem of polarization, how much of it do you think is polarization? How much do you think it is to the beginning of a huge decentralization and fragmentation?
Well, I think in some ways, those are not mutually exclusive, because I think the fragmentation that we are experiencing now is ultimately a result of a particular kind of developmental polarization that's happened with the rise of the postmodern progressive, what we call the postmodern progressive worldview. Some folks in the integral world might call it the green meme, but ultimately, we sort of believe that the fragmentation that we're experiencing is kind of baked into that perspective on the world. And so, and in many ways, rightly so. It's an important, that kind of differentiation is an important stage in growth, as we all well know. But ultimately, if allowed to just continue to splinter into all these different sub-identities and, continue to differentiate and fracture, we'll get to an unhealthy place. I mean, we're already in an unhealthy place around that. So I think even that fracturing is part of a larger order that the developmental perspective tries to account for, and therefore by providing hopefully some better metaphors and models for why that is happening. Our hope is that this new worldview that we think is now emerging, call it progressive, call it integral, call it meta-modern, call it whatever you'd like, but we believe that that is an idea whose time has come, and it is essentially the sort of framework for starting to reintegrate some of these things that have been splintered by the postmodern progressive worldview.
That leads me to want to try to set up and also exaggerate the difference between us, because we agree on most things. But I think if we're going to try to embody these two slightly different overlapping tendencies within the integrative political vision, I'm maybe representing the idealistically over suspicious, unreasonable integral left that has a little bit more integration of and hope for the postmodern, thinking that we haven't really seen it yet. And there's this other side, which then we might say is it's sort of cryptocentrist, overly modernist, developmental moderates who don't understand that the problem is coming from modernism rather than coming from postmodernism, right? So that's the exaggerated take that I would use to sort of describe what I see as the tension in the community. But I'm curious what you see as sort of the major, if there were two tendencies within the integrative political vision, does it sound like what I described, or would you say it a little differently?
I would say that is the that's the perception of the integral left side, is that we are, we're somehow advancing kind of a more modernist approach as opposed and being more critical of postmodern. But I don't think that is. I mean, there's truth to that, but I don't think that that's the way that we would think about our position in this space. I think the sort of philosophy and the model itself of this sort of spiral of cultural development would a fundamental kind of dialectic that shows up there is that the previous, each stage brings with it its own externalities and challenges and blind spots and, having gone too far with its particular approach, right, and creates all these challenges and challenging life conditions, which, then essentially the next stage of culture's job is to somehow reconcile and to, hopefully transcend and include and fix some of the problems that come from the previous cultural stage. All of this, I will say, and I'll just put this out as a disclaimer, is an oversimplification of the realities of our world. But, we got to have our maps. We have to have our ways of talking about these things. So, just know that I and we are aware that these are oversimplifications. Nonetheless, really, I think that the challenge that arose with postmodernism itself is that it rightly saw the limitations of the modernist perspective. It saw all the environmental, destruction that was, occurring as a sort of byproduct of the modernist worldview. It saw the social inequalities. It saw the sort of, the veiling of power in the search for truth and objectivity and all those sort of things. So the postmodern worldview rightly saw all of these pieces of modernity that it thought were atrocious and essentially pushed off against those externalities and negativities by creating, essentially this new vision for what life was about and where we were headed, and all of those values that it brought were really important. The The challenge, though, is that it's really an antithetical stance. It is not doing a very. I would say that the postmodern worldview is doing a very poor job of transcending and including what has come, the best of what has come before it, and learning to, not lose all of the major gains and positive developments that the previous worldviews have brought to the fore. So we see, like, I'm not denying that it is ultimately that sort of modernist worldview that is unsustainable. We would completely agree with meta-progressives or progressives that modernity in and of itself is unsustainable and that we need to continue to grow. I think where we would differ is the antithetical stance that progressive postmodernism has brought to modernity and traditionalism is so vehement and so in some ways just like monological that it truly risks, number one, alienating the 75% of the population who make meaning through those different worldviews, but it also truly risks like losing and forgetting the important values and insights and truths and social cohesion and all of that those two other major worldviews bring. So because postmodernism spends so much time critiquing and rejecting, modernist and traditionalist frames, we see part of the integral or developmental project as being a revalorization of those worldviews in the eyes of hopefully progressives, but making sure that someone is speaking for the important critical values that those two worldviews brought to society, and not to just reject them. So, I guess my argument would be if each stage is cultural sort of stage is truly pushing back against the previous one, it makes it difficult to differentiate yourself from postmodernism if you as an integralist or as a meta-modernist are constantly criticizing modernity and overlooking the pathologies of progressivism. It starts to seem to me that there's a fusion there that actually hasn't been a clear enough differentiation to be able to pull away and appropriately train your fire on the previous stage that is creating, in some ways, while I would agree that modernism is creating the actual unsustainabilities, I think that progressivism is making the situation worse because of that antithetical approach and because of that fragmentation and because of that kind of transcend without including. So that's why we focus a lot of our criticism on progressivism.
Yeah, there's obviously a problem. There's an insufficiency in the postmodern or progressive ethos, right? And there's different ways of interpreting what that insufficiency is. Maybe it's an adequate embodiment of postmodernism, and postmodernism itself is insufficient. Maybe it's not really postmodernism, it's something else, just using postmodern concepts. And I think there's a tendency of a little bit of tension between communities that think that we've actually seen what progressive and postmodern views are and realize they're insufficient and have to go beyond them. And another group of people says we haven't actually clarified what they are. They haven't gone deep enough. The degree of critique is still insufficient. We don't really understand the mechanisms fully, that postmodernism has just started this project, and it won't be for some time before we know what it's really up to. But from the meta-progressive point of view, one of the things you have to do when you come in from the bigger, more encompassing layer is not just put the systems next to each other, but say of each one, what's an actual and a healthy version of that system.
Right.
So if I think there's a lot still to be seen in the postmodern progressive view, then it becomes my responsibility to say what is or is not actually postmodern or progressive, and what would a healthy version of it look like, and how do we, from the bigger view, throw our weight behind that as much as we can.
Yeah, and the reason you're suggesting that that approach would throw its weight behind progressivism is because that's sort of the next big bubble that's sort of culturally moving forward. So rather than sort of moving beyond it, you're saying
it's the largest chunk that's in the game at the moment, right? If you got a big chunk of second tier people, yeah, of course, throw behind that. But we don't. And so who would be our player to back under the condition that we could try to make them a more authentic, healthier version of what we hope they're going to be?
Yeah.
But then they get to that second problem, which is the mainstream facing thing that you guys do pretty well, which is how do you build a coalition of public support that allows that to occur rather than just fights back against the progressives tooth and nail?
Yep. Yeah, and I, I'm emphasizing right now the kind of pushback that we feel like we need to do against some of the pathologies of postmodernism. But, we want to be really clear that we're not, coming from this position that's anti-progressive or postmodern, doesn't recognize that the important new values that it brought to the fore. I think it's hard to, the number of healthy expressions of progressivism right now are really limited. I mean, there's a lot of lack of healthy expressions of modernism, traditionalism right now too. But, just focusing on that sort of leading wave that, as you say, is in the game. I suppose Bernie Sanders is about as healthy a version of progressivism as you're going to get. He has not gotten lost in some of the kind of cultural eddies that progressivism has been obsessed with over the last, few years, especially, whether that's race or whether that's, kind of the transgenderism sort of fight that's going on right now. Like, I think he has stayed pretty close to the kind of economic progressivism that in many ways someone like me is supportive of. So I think part of it is that there's just very few healthy examples of that. And so I hear you saying, well, if there's very few healthy examples of that, shouldn't we be trying to focus our efforts on increasing the health of those progressivism? And I think that that's a really valuable charge. In some ways, that's what we're trying to do, is separate those sort of externalities and disasters of progressivism from the really positive values, and help to lift those up and help to, as much as we are trying to revalorize modernity and traditionalism in the eyes of progressives, we also have a responsibility to try and revalorize progressivism, or the healthy, positive parts of it, in the eyes of modernists and traditionalists. So I think that's a really valuable piece of work. I think the other kind of interesting question in all of this, and Steve has talked about this a little bit, but there's this idea that where are we in progressivism as a kind of cultural wave, right? And I think it's a really interesting question. Like, in some ways, it seems to me that if I had to pick, I would say we are post-peak progressivism. Like, we have sort of, it has brought the new values it needed to. It has changed society in these really important ways, and it is now starting to run up against its own limitations, and starting to generate significantly more problems and externalities than it is solving. But you could make the argument that whatever comes, quote unquote, after isn't actually something different, that it's a more mature form of postmodernism that then reintegrates after all the differentiation that happened in early phase. So that's a interesting question, and I kind of hear you saying that you feel like that wave is just actually starting, that we're not post peak progressivism. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, there's a little bit of ambiguity there, right? Like, it's even in the theory where, if green is described as early vision logic, then vision logic is just a maturing of green. But if green is described as the end of the first tier, then there's a more radical shift. So I think nobody's really sure about this, but I do think that green is young and barely begun in many respects, that we haven't seen most of what its best thinkers have suggested we do. And that what we've mostly seen from it is a version of it that's been co-opted by the earlier systems, and the sense that it's sort of coming apart and revealing its flaws looks to me a lot like that traditional and modern have taken over a lot of the things that we're referring to as progressive. that we're seeing a lot of, like the woke phenomenon is behaviorally indistinguishable from a lot of things we would associate with that blue amber traditionalist behavior, just with a different set of talking points. And the way we've seen the progressives be assimilated by and in a way undermined by the existing modernist corporate bureaucratic political structure suggests that a lot of the insufficient, hysterical, self-destructive, non-appreciative, contractive versions are some kind of result of the pushback from the other systems. I don't know if we talked about this. I bring this up all the time now since I heard it. Counter anti-disintermediation is a phrase from like these tech communities, because these guys in the 60s thought they were building these new tools and they would remove the mediators and set people free. They were going to disintermediate. But then there was anti-disintermediation right away. There was organized attempts to reassert platforms of control because that's where the money can be made over these liberating, decentralizing electronic systems. So a lot of the people in that world are saying, yeah, the thing is not to set up the new tools. The thing is to set up a preparation for the fact that the system is going to push back hard against the new thing. And then what you see is not a free and open internet, but a total control by a few economic super predators over this thing that used to be a frontier. So I imagine a lot of that same thing happens with worldviews and value systems, that as they emerge, the underlying power structures in the background system get on top of it, start to replace it with duplications of itself, start to degenerate it in any way that they can to undermine what they experience as a new adversary.
Yeah, I don't look at it that way. And, you know, you can be free to call my perspective naive. I'm assuming that that's how it would appear. But I just, this idea of, I get that power structures and power is the name of the game, you know, in all of these kind of cultural worldviews, right? They're all vying for power. They're all vying for influence. But I don't, I'm not quite as cynical that all of the efforts of either the sort of co-opting idea or the idea that I think each of these stages and the people who are the leaders, you know, culturally for each of these kind of worldviews are legitimately expressing what they believe to be the most positive values that they have been able to see in their, you know, lifetime of experience. And so even your most, you know, quote unquote greedy capitalist, you know, is actually, you know, expressing a set of values that are legitimate and hard won. And it may, you know, there may be parts of it that they're, you know, are more cynical or more predatory. But I think for the most part, most of the people, you know, in these spaces, whether it's politicians or, you know, titans of business, are actually enacting the values that they think are best for the world. And so I guess I just, you know, that idea of co-opting is itself, you know, a very postmodern sort of perspective. And it doesn't give the, it sort of assumes that everyone is sort of vulnerable to this, to being co-opted by these different forces, and that they're not in fact enacting their own values. And that's how I see it. So I think everyone is enacting the values that they, you know, are allegiant to. And so I think there's certainly a way in which, you know, there are lots of young progressives, for example, especially in the woke kind of, you know, movement, who are, sure, they sound like they're talking about progressive sort of worldview, but are actually in their sort of their own ability to make meaning and their own ability to be self-reflective and, you know, see their own biases and things like that, are actually operating from more of a traditional kind of mindset. But I don't think that's the majority of the folks who sort of make meaning out of the progressive postmodern worldview. I think the majority of them are, you know, truly coming from a more complex, a more evolved frame of looking at the world than, you know, your average sort of modernist frame. Like they're seeing things that modernists may not be able to see. So in that sense, it is an evolution. The problem is that it has now become, and its philosophical roots are so deconstructive. It's like they want to break everything down to this. Yeah, they just want to break everything down and kind of start afresh and look afresh. And that is valuable. It was needed. It is still to some degree needed, but there has to come a point where we start to rebuild, and we have to rebuild on top of the best of what's come before. So I think the progressive, the sort of progressive worldview is doing what it's supposed to do, but I don't think it is. I think, for example, one of the things that the postmodern worldview should be doing is doing more experimentation, right? It's like the idea of sort of micro community, micro culture experimentation is a very progressive postmodern sort of thing. So it should be experimenting and seeing how these different, approaches to living and relating and, and being don't have to be the way that modernity sort of and traditionalism handed it to them. Fair enough. But there's also a way in which that experimentation and the impulse towards that experimentation is not going to create the next structure that's capable of helping us solve the problems we have to solve and continuing to kind of grow in this large scale, which is why we're really focused on sort of trying to bring some of these ways of thinking out of the kind of smaller intellectual communities that they're in right now and bring them into more mainstream, spaces, right? And conversations and media, because we think that there is something to add there and that that experimentation still needs to happen, but we're not going to give the keys to society to people who are experimenting on the edges of what may not be sustainable. It's likely not sustainable. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. And, a sense of deep continuity and a sense of figuring out how to use progressives properly. Right? I think these are very important things. And I don't, I don't want to call you naive because but I think that what you surfaced there is at the heart of one of the fuzzy fissure sites in the community. And it has to do with how upfront or suspicious people are about identity and values and systems.
Yep.
It seems like the great postmodern progressive thinkers added a level of thinking about what values are and where they come from that a lot of people maybe on the integral left feel is not sufficiently integrated into a lot of developmental politics, because it comes with this suspicion that what people say their values are not necessarily their values, and that to a large degree it represents their embedding in various systems of habit, operation, and incentive. And that you can't necessarily check for the value system by asking the individual to access their self-knowledge and verbally communicate it to you. That's a bit of a modernist fantasy about the rational, competent individual agent that has to be undermined. Not completely undermined, but that this sense of ideological analysis, this sense that our statements don't necessarily reflect our reality, that the systemic and the unconscious are huge players in this game. I think some people feel that really strongly, and other people feel that a little, but are happier to take people at face value more.
Yeah, and I put myself in that latter camp. I don't deny, all the insights we've had about, the motivations that go into how we make our decisions and some of the unconscious processes and the insecurities and, and then that's even just on the individual side. Then when you pull in the collective, like all the different kind of forces that go into what comes out of our mouth and what we decide to do in any given moment. I think that it is again, the theory itself predicts this, right? Like, modernism and what we'll call right now post-progressivism are going to be attack back towards individualism, right? They're going to be attacked back towards that side. Now, hopefully, at a much higher level, and having understood that the individual side of the street is not, is not superior in any fundamental way to the collective side of the street. But I think it's important to recognize that kind of basic dialectic that spiral dynamics picked up, better than anyone and earlier than anyone, is a pretty fundamental part of this. And so I think it's part of the green worldview to prioritize that collective, and both culturally and sociologically, and systems and economics, and to prioritize that collectivity and essentially say that, like, the individual is essentially beholden to these external and internal collective forces that shape the individual. And there's tremendous truth to that postmodernism gets credit for sort of understanding, but that can go too far. And ultimately, I want to live in a world where people are not that individuals are not expressions of collective forces, that there's also their own agency and sovereignty that is real, and that their values and the things that they're attracted to and the things that want to do are ultimately that when it comes to agency, the individual has the agency. Like, collectives shape, right, and feed in and influence, but they don't ultimately have an agency of their own. Lots of theories right now coming out to the contrary, but I don't go that far. I think ultimately that individual sort of sovereignty, and that individuals, whether or not they can fully express their values as cleanly and as sort of with as much integrity as we would all aspire to be, like, sure, I get that that's not going to be possible, that we're always going to fall out of line with our values. We're not always going to be able to enact them. We're going to be, sort of swept up in all kinds of other forces that shape how we're going to express them. But ultimately, I want to believe that I choose to live in a world where people, that their values, the things that they say are important to them, and the things that they feel are important to them are at least aspirational for what they what they value in the world.
I appreciate how upfront you are about that, and I do think aspirational is a good word here. Like, one of the things when I try to think about modernity, there's a question of whether or not it is represented by the kinds of classical liberal values we associate with the 17th century Enlightenment thinkers. And what they were setting up is something aspirational, whether that's primarily aspirational for individuals who hold those values, who are trying to get there but recognize their value, or whether those values are sort of a rhetorical horizon under which the machinery of bureaucratic capitalism does its work. Either way, they do form some kind of aspirational framing, and I think we have to think of values primarily in that way. I'm skeptical of the autonomy communion alternation between stages. I think it is a result of looking back at particular sequences that might have gone different ways, and that there is an important role for the progressive individual that hasn't been sufficiently clarified and may have gotten lost. It may have been more clear in the late 60s, right? This sense of returning to the somatic experience of the sensory body that people had. I think that's part of what the green individual is. It's going to drop out of the self-identity of orange, but they're not sacrificing individuality, even though they're thinking of it as embodied and as having a large unconscious element and being a lot more inwardly plural, but not necessarily the same as the society and the communion taking dominance. And I'm not sure that there is a lot of social suppression of individual capacity and liberty going on in our systems at the moment. That worries me a great deal. I want to see more liberty for decentralized autonomous agents. And I think that's the The way in which we maximize the intelligence of systems is to empower the individuals and make them as healthy as possible.
Agreed.
I'm not sure that the suppression is coming out of a worldview, value system, and philosophy that permeates the progressives. I think it might be the accumulating result of modernity's overreach as a result of the new kinds of tools it has at its disposal and the new kinds of pressures it feels that it has to push back against and reassert itself over. I'm just not sure. I think it could go either way interpretively.
Yeah, but I guess I wouldn't. Okay, so modernity is not alone in trying. Modernist thought is not alone in trying to protect itself and reassert itself against external threats. Every worldview, every sort of stage of culture tries to do that. So modernity is not alone in trying to do that. Now, it may appear because modernity has a great percentage of the power in society that they are more effective at doing that, and they have more means through which to sort of reassert the dominance of its view. But what we would call green progressivism has attained tremendous cultural power, and is doing the exact same thing right now, that it's sort of perceiving these threats to its way of looking at the world and its values, and is trying to reassert its cultural dominance as it's getting mostly attacked from previous worldview structures, but also starting to be criticized, critiqued from beyond. So I don't think that's exclusive to modernity. There's something you said that I wanted to come back to, but I guess what I would say is, I think on that sort of individual and collective thing, I recently read Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge. Have you heard of it?
Yep.
Have you read it?
I have not.
So it was kind of eye-opening to me. It's a really, really powerful book, and it talks about, if you want to get a sense of those kind of liberal values that you talked about and what they bring and how it works, it's an important book to read, because I think it shows exactly the pieces of modernity that have to be carried forward to what's next. And it was, as you sort of point out, it was that for the first time, essentially in history, drawing a space around the individual as sovereign and giving them the freedom to express their values and live their lives in a way that was like, truly differentiated from the collective that was, of course, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years ago when this first emerged. So it's easy to say, okay, well, yeah, sure, but that's run its course. Like the sovereignty of the individual has led to all these other challenges. And I think that that's true, but we also have to recognize that the good that particular sort of insight created in society was tremendous, and so much so that we now take it for granted. The idea that I, as an individual, can pursue, within limitations, but can pursue my own interests and have a degree of freedom and independence from the demands of the collective. Like, we take that for granted. So much so that we are sort of, some of the pathologies that you start to see coming out of progressive postmodernism is this sort of illiberal kind of approach. And it shows that they have not understood the real value that was brought through those particular value sets. And so, I'm with Rauch, like that, the sort of the liberties in economic freedom, in religious freedom, in freedom to explore questions and knowledge that previously would have been considered taboo or antithetical or whatever, that those freedoms that came about in early modernity and have been carried through to some degree are probably the greatest social innovation in the history of the world. That there has never been something that has been more catalytic and transformative. Came with all kinds of crap came along with that, right? But it was a pretty powerful social innovation that I think we have to be careful to not lose touch with. I think if you put yourself, Steven Pinker, things like folks like that have made a big argument about put yourself back in the 1500s, anywhere in the world, literally anywhere in the world, and the life conditions that you would find yourself in, you would run screaming. I would make a similar argument. Put yourself in the mind of your average person. You take yourself now, put your mind in the mind of somebody in the 1500s, anywhere in the world, you would also run screaming, because it would be so confining. It would be so, the culture would be so stifling. The sort of limitations on the individual would be so pervasive that you would run screaming, not just from the external conditions, but from the internal conditions of the mind prior to some of the differentiations and innovations that were made by modernity. Again, I'm doing a lot of defending of modernity, but it's because I feel very strongly that part of our job here is certainly to transcend, but it's also to better include the best of what came before. And I see a lot of, what's great about modernity being devalued and dismissed. And I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, I agree that it's dangerous. And, the core values and the healthy versions of them from each of these systems need to be protected. And, I think there's a strong public idea, which is always going to be a little bit of a caricature of these value systems, is not really reflective of what a good, healthy, authentic version would be, right? A modernist who really lives those values and can be modern in their heart and their mind and their body and their social affairs and their morality. I think that's pretty rare, even under conditions of supposedly widespread modernity, just like it's comparatively rare to find a multi-systemic, healthy, authentic, agentic, progressive or traditionalist.
Right.
So we definitely have to stand for those things. What the source of the illiberalism is, I think, is ambiguous. It's debated. At least in my mind, it's debated. Right. I see some of it looks like it's coming from progressives who haven't sufficiently appreciated through their personal experience what it means to stand for those values and what those values have given us. Some of it might be the fact that modernity has a built-in self-degenerating function over time. Right, which is to say that the subsystems of modernity are incentivized to get in each other's way. And if you let modernity run for a while, it will eventually sabotage itself and become an illiberal version of liberalism. And then also a lot of it is pre-modernists who, of course, don't understand it yet, haven't even seen what it represents, even though they can apparently drive cars and vote or even espouse postmodern values. So for me, there's those three zones in which the illiberalism might be coming from, and probably is coming from all three of them in some degree.
Yeah, for sure. I guess, again, though, I would say, what you describe as sort of like, I forget the term you just used, but, modernism has within it a sort of, would you call it a
self-degenerating function or
self-degenerating function. Every stage has a self-degenerating function. Every stage, any perspective, any particular point of view, initially, whether it's realized in the individual or sort of realized in a collective culture, it is this new insight, this new truth, this new way of looking that affords, all kinds of new possibilities. And by the very fact that it is a point of view, can it can and will pathologize eventually, because especially if taken to the extremes, and allowed to see, it's like, the metaphor I love to use with this is the same one that we use in all kinds of things, which is that, a worldview, a perspective is a hammer, and it suddenly yields this, new ability to hit the nail, but it starts to see everything as a nail, and that is an inevitable byproduct of any new perspective. Now, hopefully, as the perspectives build on top of one another over time and become more complex and have higher degrees of freedom, and are even able to recognize the pattern themselves and self-correct to some degree. That's the hope, is that each, as we move along, that's what's going to happen. But eventually it will overreach. Some point, meta-modernism will overreach, and will start to generate externalities that have to be solved by something more complex, more inclusive, more higher degrees of freedom, all of that. And so I guess I wouldn't pin that just on modernism. I think the reason we tend to see it in modernism, because modernism has been spectacularly successful. So it has been so successful that the power, to drive those externalities and to take it too far and to overreach is just more visible because of its success.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Every level, if a level could self-diagnose and self-correct, you wouldn't need any more evolutionary levels.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. And so they all run astray, and our temperaments are going to lean us in different directions. Some people are going to lean in the direction of going, oh, I see self-degenerating facets of green, blaming orange. And other people can say, well, I see the self-degenerative aspects of orange, blaming green. And our feeling of which one's the greater problem will differ from person to person. I think there's a reasonable argument saying that because modernity has been so spectacularly successful, it is now the privileged target of critique, because its forms of progress are currently instantiating the ceiling. And we're rushing forward to a bunch of crises that can't be dealt with using the logic that's been extremely successful for several hundred years. And in order to face any of those things, the biggest thing that's holding us back is the limiting function of self-degenerating modernity. And the other degenerating effects are problematic, but they aren't as in charge because they haven't been as spectacularly successful. So I don't know that I always feel that way, but I'm certainly sympathetic to an argument that says this is the elephant in the room. This is the thing that's holding us back, and we don't have a lot of time to just generate a bunch of wonderful, new, mutually appreciative solutions. We have a few urgent crises, and we have something blocking us from solving those things, and that thing has to be removed.
Yeah, that's one. Yes, I think there are elements that need to be removed. There are elements of modernity that need to be deconstructed and sort of rebuilt in new ways. But I also think that there are that a worldview that is capable of sort of seeing truly the best of what came along could also tap into some of those powers of modernity in a way that progressivism green is just not. And there's a naivete, I guess, and I don't know what that naivete comes from, because theoretically progressivism is this, essentially it's the most advanced worldview yet to sort of achieve, a significant scale. But there is certainly a naivete to it that, I think developmentalists, integralists, meta-modernists are, because we can see each of those different, what isn't, because we can see the power of each of these different sort of worldviews, like it's up to us to separate, what is not functional and working about each one of these and from what is, and to leverage each of the levels of what is. So, for example, for the Institute for Cultural Evolution, we've created these position we call them issue positions, which are sort of mini policy pieces that we write on big challenges, political challenges of the day. And we essentially are striving for what we would call win-win-win. So how do we create, what would a solution look like that really spoke to the values of each of traditionalism, modernism, and postmodernism? And when it comes to our climate change one, there's the Breakthrough Institute has done some really interesting work on this. That a lot of the kind of the environmental regulations and things like that have been built by progressivism, and rightly so, thank God that they have, are naive when it comes to actually solving the sort of energy issues that are at the heart of climate change, and that we're not going to get there through renewables alone. But everybody wants to think that we're going to somehow go backwards, and we're going to be able to rely on renewables for 100% of our energy, and that's like somehow not going to cause a massive economic collapse across multiple nations. If multiple nations did that, immediately switch to renewables, cut out any fossil fuels, and then didn't do anything around, for example, nuclear, we would see an economic collapse that would potentially rival some of the challenges we're going to see as a result of unmitigated climate change going forward. So, the question is how do you, for example, sort of tap the power of the free market and business, and you use that as an engine for solving some of these problems, while you also curtail some of the more, problematic aspects of, rampant capitalism and globalism, things like that. Like they're, to me, if you can't pull those apart, then you're just going to have this naive, like, we have to get rid of, we have to go backwards. And I see a lot of that being advocated for. And I just feel like it's our job as people who can see the patterns here to say, no, wait, like, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Am I making sense?
Yeah, obviously a regressive is not a progressive
right.
in some way, right? And there's regressive tendencies in all of these systems.
Right.
We've obviously got a lot of things within the structure of modernity that sabotage the values we hope modernity are going to generate. We've got a lot of things within progressives that seem to be partly thought out, but incompletely aware of how you would actually bring those forward in order to achieve those values. Now, if you were a strong critic of modernity, you might say, well, what we've got are a bunch of narrow or superficial postmodern people because they've been educated in a new cognitive value set, but they haven't actually been able to live through the life experiences that would make themselves capable of embodying those. And the reason they haven't is because the current world under the dominion of modernity has set up a situation in which people are not living natural, in which the traditional reality has been really undermined and destabilized, and people are not going through the normal living conditions that would be required in order for them to fill out the post-modernity that they're hearing about. So when they get it, they're actually just experientially and emotionally and socially and morally immature beings because of modernity. Now, that would be the extreme critique. I'm not sure I really want to lean into that. The thing I would actually like to touch on is an undecidability maybe about what's more naive, a kind of moderate tone or a kind of radical tone. Right. Mm-hmm. And that has to do inside us and also publicly. Like publicly, there's certain kinds of radicalism that aren't going to work. But are we being insufficiently aware of how we have to balance things out nicely with everybody and do more balanced solutions? Or are we insufficiently aware of how urgent the situation is and how radical the solutions need to be and how big a gamble we need to take and fast?
Yeah. Yeah, you and I spoke a little bit about this earlier, which is, I do think that we need to start experimenting and taking some risks. And as you say, there need to be some radical elements to this. and it kind of comes down to this idea of left, right, center, which again, that frame has its limitations, but it's also pretty useful. And I guess what I would say, a way of shortcutting the sort of long tangent I think I was about to go on, is to say, like, you always need both. Like, you're going to need moderating forces and you're going to need progressive forces. Like, that is why we have a left and a right to begin with. That is why, what we would describe as the prime political polarity is fix what's wrong and preserve what's right. That's ultimately what you're talking about if you pull conservatism and progressivism out as a polarity, right? Not necessarily as stages, but now saying these are two drives that evolution has to get right in order to create sustainable new realities. Is it has to be able to get both of those pieces right. And so, I guess I would say that that's an argument for why you need a Josh Leonard and why you need a Layman Pascal, is because you need some people pushing the new shoots and pushing for a more radical sort of progressive push forward. And you need other people saying, hold on. Let's make sure that we are preserving what's right out of each of these previous pieces. And that in some ways, in this world that we're a part of, you and I can both play an important role on different ends of that polarity.
Yeah, it seems like everything's got to operate through a kind of oppositional processing in order to get anything done. And it's certainly my feeling that something analogous to left and right goes all the way down the developmental stack, right? Even basic particles of matter have to be able to preserve their form, but also go be asked
exactly
to have changes.
Yep.
Right? And so then I think the basic thing for me, the first move, if a person wants to think integrally about politics, is to start to separate the levels from the left and the right, because very often we have a social conversation in which we put way too many things on the so-called left and way too many things on the so-called right. And we don't notice that every stage should have a left and a right. And so then there's a debate between whose left and right mostly holds sway in a given society and what higher levels of left and right would look like. And so we would hope that a meta-modern integral left and right is going to emerge, and it will have this complementary operation. But also one of the things about trying to figure out what authentic, healthy progressivism looks like is what's their left and their right. And this is too seldom even speculated about in my experience. Discussion on the Joe Rogan podcast between himself and Jon Stewart was, I thought, a really good example of progressive left and progressive right, because they agree on policies. They're both basically Bernie Sanders when it comes to what we should do institutionally in our society. But one of them is a very sensitive vegetarian, and the other one is an aggressive bow hunter. Right. So there's a classic distinction there, but a distinction within that realm. And I think one of the things we need in order to stabilize our sense of what developmental politics is a good, generally communicated in our communities sense of what left and right feels like at all the levels.
Yeah. So then let me ask you, because that idea, I don't think it's certainly 50-50. I think there are, in the sort of green stage, there are a small percentage of people who are ultimately have are more typologically conservative, and then the vast majority are more typologically progressive. But I guess I would say is I completely agree. And what I have found to be incoherent potentially about the integral left approach is that I see very little actual integration of that sort of more conservative, preserve what's right value. So how do you see those things? In some ways, I feel like I'm always constantly arguing on the more conservative side, not because I'm a conservative, but because I as a developmentalist can see how that polarity is all the way up and all the way down. And so I find myself arguing on behalf of what is being missed from the conversation. And I find that generally being missed from conversations in the integral left. So how do you see that conservative, value being expressed in these sort of integral left movements.
Yeah, I do see a significant absence of it, and I'm very sympathetic to it from my own experience. And I think a lot of it comes down to lived experience and not to how we think about our social values. I grew up in a hippie back to the land situation, right? So you've got healthy green, but you're situated among farmers and fishermen and hunters. So those are the people you know, right? And that's one of the things that's not afforded as frequently now as it used to be. Those sort of living experiences, people who grow up immersed in the mediated and largely urban culture don't get to go through the formative experiences that ground you in what healthy conservatism is. So when you get to your higher value understandings, you don't have that to check with. You just assume that those are all the deplorables or something like that.
Yep, exactly.
So I think a lot of it is people having the experiences and the relationships that undergird the conservative sensibility. And I don't think we're going to see a lot of it in progressive or post-progressive spaces unless people are having those lived experiences.
It's interesting. So it's almost more experiential for you.
Yeah, I think it's experiential. And I think that's a little bit of that progressive thing about like how the embedding in systems creates the values, right? I think that there's a lot to think about where you came from and what you lived through, and also like what are the media technologies and things like that go on. Like one of the things about how are we going to preserve our liberal values is what are we doing with literacy? Because those were to a large degree the values of the literate people and of print literacy. And if we're moving very fast into a digital network society, can you sustain those, right? Unless people are predominantly book-learned people, is there a way to preserve those values? And we can go around and say, yes, we've got to preserve rationality and individualism and agency and that. But if the system is just going to rush completely into a different set of media networks, then maybe there's really no way to hold on to those things. And we have to adapt to a very strange new landscape. I think I got away from the question there. I think there are a few people calling out for a re-embrace of like a deep right, sort of a deep kind of conservatism, because they feel the insufficiency of what's being discussed in areas of society that they otherwise agree with, right? And I think that the new sciences tell us a lot about that, like anti-fragility and how you keep your body healthy and how you do exercise and how you keep your mind straight. All those sorts of things are coming up against discoveries that suggest pushing, making efforts, not being so accommodating, holding space, holding form are essential to our general health and well-being. So I think there's a creep from those sorts of disciplines, new neurosciences and things like that, into the discussion, making people sympathetic to conservative values. And I think also the awareness of the function of complex systems is bringing up a lot of ancient heuristic value stances that were evolved by human beings to handle complex systems that
without even explicitly understanding that we're building to be able to manage those. Yeah,
exactly. Like when I think like what's a progressive or post-progressive conservative, I think of Edmund Burke, I think of Nietzsche, I think of Nassim Taleb, I think of a lot of people who are saying, whoa, we don't understand how all this works, right? And we need to, in a way, double down on the things that have been tested by time, that are our tried and true methods for approaching things that we don't know how to comprehend systematically. And the tendency of the left, I think, at all levels, is to exaggerate the degree to which they could mobilize to implement a new change.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, great. No, I mean, I think that's well said, and I would completely agree. And I think, as I was a good progressive for, a good part of my adulthood. And it's only been now that I've kind of really gone back to start to explore some of the roots of both modernism, but also traditionalism and conservatism, to sort of round out my understanding of what the value those sort of thought forms bring. And like you, I've found that there's a wisdom there that is just not essentially being embraced by Green. And I think that's part of where we can differentiate ourselves from Green as what emerges comes next is to go back, and where we can try to understand these different truths and put them into the constellation, as opposed to just like, I just don't see how you could pin yourself to one side of the political spectrum when you understand how these different systems function together. So, well said.
I don't know how familiar you are with John Bunzel and the Simpol project.
A little bit. I know a little bit about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an interesting element there. Maybe this is a tangent for what we've been saying, but their view is that the majority of the problems we're facing within nations are not actually being sourced in nations. They're being sourced in the international space, right? And unless nations were able to implement something simultaneously, they're not even in the game yet of where the problems are being sourced.
Right.
And I wondered how first of all, it's really dubious to me whether or not they can implement those sorts of simultaneous policy initiatives or not. But to what degree do you think the nation is the arena in which we can adequately assess what's going on, and it can adequately look for the sources of our problems, right? If the Americans look at the United States and go, oh, it's these people in the United States think this, and these people in the United States think this, maybe we can modify or tinker that, and they can get them together and make a change. That might all be foolhardy if the problems are not being sourced in the United States or in the minds of the population, or how do you feel about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I think it's inevitable to some degree that we are going to have to come up with transnational planetary systems of decision making and of coordinated action that are transnational. So that's inevitable. That's going to come. Now, how that comes about, is anyone's guess. And I think as you would say, as you said earlier, like, we don't necessarily have a lot of time to sort of wait for a global, mesh network governance system to solve for transnational challenges. Like, we may have to do it with what we've got, which is the nation state. And so while I wouldn't deny that's what's coming, hopefully, and I think that the kinds of proposals like Simpol are a really interesting framework for starting to think about what that might look like without completely transcending the nation state. I think we also have to work with what we have, and to me, that then puts the sort of pressure on nation states to act as leaders, and to sort of chart moral leadership and environmental leadership and all kinds of leadership in the globe, and to some degree, where possible, to do what modernity did after World War II, which is use your power to distribute power when you can. And I think we need to see another level of that. And so that's, to me, what leadership, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the US or whether it's in China or whatever, sort of, it's not likely to be in China, in my opinion, but nonetheless, I hold out the hope that that some of these nation states are going to start to learn how to share power and build some of those systems with the power that they have as new hegemons arise globally.
Yes, I hope those same things. Going beyond hope and trying to foresee a little bit of what the mid-21st century looks like is a much murkier problem.
Yeah.
We both have kids in the house, so it's a real question.
It's a real question.
What do you, when you're thinking about educating someone and setting someone up to inhabit the rest of the 21st century, what are you preparing them for? What are the skill sets? What is your hunch about the circumstances they need to be educated toward?
Mm-hmm. I think, it is so difficult to sort of predict what that's going to be and to educate for that. So I think the best that we can do, and the best hope we have collectively, is in human adaptability. And so I think the more we can, kind of have an integral developmental approach to education that, as you say, like, I like that model you're doing, part of our education. And I do think that there's moves in education that are trying to do this, integral and otherwise, where trying to kind of recapitulate the life conditions and the challenges of development in our education, so that we're learning the lessons, right, that each of those different stages can provide. So, it's such a cop-out in some ways because it's so vague, but I think adaptability and flexibility in thinking and the ability to take multiple perspectives and inhabit them with force and then step outside of them and see it from the outside, that is what hopefully this next stage, both individually and collectively, might start to bring. And, to stop pushing one side of every polarity all the way to its farthest extreme where it starts to break down. I just don't, I hope that that's not necessary. And so I want to kind of cultivate that in my son. And I think collectively we need to be starting to cultivate that as well, because it's that level of flexibility and not sort of pinning yourself down to one particular perspective or value system or ideology that is going to make us hopefully able to adapt going forward.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. The flexibility and the adaptability has to become central to the educational project, because we just don't know how much continuity or disruption is coming. And the disruptions that are coming, we can't predict which disruptions are coming. So it's a really preparing for uncertainty, and the whole set of wisdom skills that goes with that, I think, has to be the core of the educational approach now.
Yep.
While we're on personal questions, how do you vote? Are you a tactical voter, or do you vote for the person whose statements agree with your values the most?
No, that's a good question. I am, I guess what I would say is, like, in primaries, I vote for the person who expresses my values the most. And then when it comes down to the general elections, I tend to vote more practically. I think about what the system needs as best as I can perceive it from from as wide a view as I can. I think about what the system needs, and I make my vote based on that. So it depends on what phase of the voting process we're in.
Good answer. Things differ at scales. What about sources of information? Who do you turn to for news about what's going on politically? Who do you find reliable, or at least worth your time to pay attention to?
Well, this is probably one of the areas where I'm going to be, although, I don't, as soon as I say this, I'm not sure that's true, but I would say that I am more of a consumer of what one might call mainstream news than most of the people are who at least hang out online in the spaces you and I hang out online in. And I think there's certainly, you're getting a particular, the Overton window of the news that I am consuming is limited, right? Just like everybody's probably is to some degree. And I could be more diligent in seeking out alternative sort of perspectives. But part of what I feel like my job is, literally my job is to try and break through into that mainstream conversation with these, developmental perspectives. I try to pay attention to where that mainstream conversation is going. So I have my New York Times subscription, and I have my Washington Post subscription, and I have my Wall Street Journal subscription, and I have my Atlantic subscription, and a few others. And so I'm tracking that mainstream conversation and that mainstream thought, and I'm trying to identify the people, right, or the narratives that look like they would at least be receptive to the kind of approach that we're taking, in the hopes that we can break into those conversations. And so, we're hiring, the Institute for Cultural Evolution is hiring a communications director. We've got that position posted right now. If anyone's listening to this and you think you're qualified, please come to our website and throw your hat in the ring. Ideally, we're looking for somebody with a broad sort of a real depth of experience in communication and marketing and publicity, but we're also looking for somebody who's got this philosophical framework and understands it and can help us to sort of push it into the national dialogue. So anyway, that was my little plug. But the reason we're investing in that position is because we think, that's what we're trying to do is to influence that mainstream conversation. So if anything, I may prioritize and bias some of that because that's the news and perspective that I'm listening to, but at least I'm doing it consciously.
Nice. Yeah, I saw that. I saw an email about that position, and it was an interesting thing for me to contemplate how close or far away I am from that role. Because it's similar to some of the things I do, but there's also some dissimilarities. I don't know. But if you can't find anybody, I might be willing to give it a try.
I'll give you a call. Okay, sounds good.
I'm curious what you think are the leverage points that could make the most difference in the system. Like Andrew Yang, for example, is trying to get a coalition together of third parties around ranked choice voting, right? And there's a good argument to be made that really no policy and no candidate can make substantial change as long as we still have the same choice-making mechanisms in place. Yeah. That to make any change, you have to change that mechanism somehow. Right. So there's a good argument. Now, whether or not that you can leverage third parties to do anything is pretty dubious. But that's an example of an argument that it would be tolerable enough to the system to let that change through, and it would have a huge potential downstream effect. Where do you look for those sorts of effects? What do you think has a lot of potential leverage going forward?
I think that it's a little bit of chicken and egg, right? Whether it's like the systems that we use, like ranked choice voting and, gerrymandering and, all the other sort of reforms that are being pushed in these spaces. We see many of those as being really necessary and they would make a tremendous difference. The challenge is in order to get those, there has to be enough consensus and goodwill and compromise, and sort of pulling back from the battle that our politics has to become to be able to enact those, right? So, while we think that those are really valuable, it's unlikely that, they're going to be able to get traction on those until we address some of these, until the culture war itself tones down. Nonetheless, I think the most potential sort of breakthrough points in our politics are in one of two places. I think one of them, as you say, is some way of third parties breaking up the political, dichotomy that we're in. I just think there's so many ways in which that could be helpful. You can already see it happening in some ways, on our, a lot of our work is sort of charting these kind of four political values on the political spectrum. And those both represent, there's polarities between the left and the right and red and blue, but there's also polarities within, depending on the different sort of worldviews and value systems within these different worldviews. So I think any political system that broke apart that sort of monopoly that the two parties have and rescattered, the options would allow the system to sort of evolve in a better way than it is now. I don't think the two-party system is inherently problematic. I think there's some powerful points to that too. I think it has its own kind of, there can be, at least in an ideal world, there's a way in which that would generate growth. But right now it's holding us back. So I think something that would break off, chunks of power from those two parties into something that was moving in a different direction could really help. So there's a third party in California that's forming that the Institute for Cultural Evolution thinks is kind of interesting. I think that what Andrew Yang is doing is really interesting. I think there's, I think it's not a high probability, but I think there's some probability of success. I could see him getting some momentum in this next presidential round. That could be really interesting. So those experiments are kind of they're the sort of system interventions that I see most likely to be successful. But then the other, sort of intervention that could change the game is just the right person. I've talked about this with you before, but I think both Trump and Obama, whatever you think of them, represent this sort of really unique breakaway of a particular individual from the party that they represent. And maybe not in how they govern, but at least in how they ran and their message and the values and the approach that they espouse were a real breakaway. And they, the metaphor I'd like to use is they both caught a wave and created the wave that they caught. And so I think there is a real potential for a charismatic person who gets some of this stuff and he doesn't fit into the sort of left-right mold to be politically innovative and to create a new wave that they can ride in on and hopefully carry the whole culture along with them. Now, that's a little bit of a savior, kind of option, which has its own downsides as we can see. But I do think that is one of the ways where quick political and cultural change can happen, is if a really smart, innovative, kind of integrally minded politician were to come in and break the categories in themselves, right? As opposed to sort of, it's the individual option that we're talking about with these sort of third parties. It'd be like that individual holding those different tensions and breaking up the kind of political value frameworks that we're used to seeing everything through.
It's integral thinkers and feelers thinking about possible political action run into this problem, which is you're stepping into a battlefield where you are going to be attacked and demonized no matter what. And that seems to be opposed to most of what we try to do internally and in our private lives and relationships. And
right.
We're so good at feeling different values and adapting to each other. There's a lot of get along resonance. How do you prepare for the actual battlefield of politics? Because if somebody was in that position, all day, every day, people would be saying that they're the worst person alive. Yeah.
Well, I think it's so interesting though, right? Because it's like, that's a possibility that they would be hated by everyone.
Yeah.
But the ideal, right? The hope would be that they would resonate with everyone, that there would be, and that kind of a person, and the approach that we're in some sense trying to do is to create some cognitive dissonance by taking positions and perspectives that you wouldn't normally associate as because they're kind of they're not coherent at one level, but at the level that we're coming from, they are coherent, right? And so part of what we're trying to do is, even though our policy pieces, for example, tend to come kind of right down the middle, we don't believe that centrism is a really viable approach. And so, if we're doing our job well, one point you might hear us saying something that sounds super conservative, and one point you might hear us saying something that sounds really liberal or progressive, and that we're bouncing around between those. And so I think certainly if you're doing it, if you're not doing it well, you're going to be seen as pissing everybody off and as shitting on their prized values. But if you're doing it right, hopefully you would sort of resonate. People would be resonating with different things, and then when they encountered a perspective that they didn't resonate with, it would cause kind of the cognitive distance that it might allow us to sort of stretch. So say, I don't know what I like about that person, or I don't know what I like about that approach, but I like it. And so that's the kind of opening that I hope it would create.
No, I like that. And I think the critique toward the post-progressives that comes maybe from the meta-ideological people is that as much as you guys say you're not centrists and you're going to fold in the polarization and make these moves, there's a cryptocentrism in there somewhere, right? And so there's this worry, and which is actually, I think, a question about how do all of us hold the difference between taking a middle position to try to make everybody happy and keeping the tension of the polarities alive and what's required in order to do that, because we so often see that fail. Like, if Hillary Clinton had taken Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren as her running mates, she would have been president. But the tendency is to take somebody who's going to be on your side and back up your decisions, not create a bunch of dissonance and friction. And we all have this tendency to back away from that because it's an enormous amount of extra work and hassle. But it seems like that's where the energy is. So how do you guys think about keeping the dynamics of the different positions alive and keeping them from simply becoming tepid water instead of hot and cold water?
Well, I can certainly say that, again, I think there's a difference between policy and sort of expressing political values. So, the best way in policy to engage these, where the energy is in these polarities is to try and incorporate the best of this while we incorporate the best of this. And sometimes it looks like centrism, sometimes it doesn't, but it's gonna have a kind of the policies themselves may end up being centrist. But I do think, that where we should be energizing both sides at the same time and using that dichotomy and finding innovative new ways to incorporate the left and the right perspectives, or whatever it is you're trying to sort of bring forward in something that's new and is not just splitting the difference between them. I'll say that, I guess if we're doing our job right, if we're doing it well, you'll hear us advocating different perspectives in kind of their pure form, and alternating between these different approaches, so that you can't just pin it down to, we're not sounding like some mushy in the middle, centrist, that we're actually, we're keeping the juice that comes from the tension of these polarities by alternating between them. I mean, the metaphor that I've used before, but I think is sort of illustrative here is the idea that, we walk by putting the right foot forward and then the left foot forward, and the right foot forward and the left foot forward. We don't move forward by hopping, with the left and the right foot at the same time. And it's overly simplistic, but the idea is if you try to, kind of split the difference between these two polarities in each action, you end up kind of sounding, as you say, like mealy-mouthed, and you lose the juice that comes from these dynamic polarities. So I think there's days where we do that better than others. But a lot of the stuff that we've written has been challenging, right? Like the pieces that we put out there are pushing back in one way or another against these different perspectives, and coming from a nice, clean kind of one side of the polarity. So, or at least emphasizing that. So we try to do that. It's easier said than done, but that's something we try to do.
Well, we're coming pretty close to the end here. The only other thing I'm really curious about is whether you think about trying to, because a lot of what you guys are doing, I think, is creating an ethos in which these changes could occur, right? You touched on with the chicken and egg thing, right? What comes first, lower left or lower right solutions? The answer is yes, right? So one of the things we have to do is create a new mood that facilitates those changes. And part of doing that is facilitated through the verbal discursive intellect, where we get together and we have discussions and we work out policies and we try to get into other discussions. But part of it is symbolic and imagistic, right? And I often think of these things like, solar panels in the back of a beaten up pickup truck, or Jack Daniels and kale, or right. Joe Rogan does this really well because he's all about UBI and bow hunting, or these sort of odd conjunctions as an aesthetic that can move through the population. And even though it might seem weird at the beginning, helps set up the background for that ethos in a way that's not just limited to reasonable, politically informed people having discussions with each other. Do you think about that other side of it?
I don't really. I think that it's not our specialty. It's not what we're focused on as a think tank. But I think that there is a huge place for that. And honestly, I think that's where, meta-modernism has probably contributed the most to this sort of liminal space, is that, is that sincere irony and the kind of more cultural and artistic and aesthetic, juxtapositions and integrations and breaking the mold, that only art can do. I think there's a huge place for that. And there's a lot of people who are working on those kinds of projects and art projects, and we're all for them. I think you're right that it sort of does create a background cultural opening for the more sort of analytical, cerebral, intellectual work that we're trying to do. So fully supportive of it, but I'm personally not a great artist. So.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Josh. This has been very rich. I think for better or worse, we probably collaboratively languaged most of what the leading edge of higher politics is at the moment.
I hope so.
We'll see how much we can push that and diversify that and strengthen that going forward.
I'd love it. Love it. It was great to talk to you, man. Always a pleasure.